Hello, good afternoon, and welcome. My name is Kende-Robb. I'm the Executive Director of the Africa Progress Panel. We are delighted to have with us today a very extinguished panel, and I'm honoured to welcome Mr. Cyril Ramaphosa. He is a Deputy President of South Africa. Mr. Colin Dyer. He is the CEO and President of JLL. Ms. Dana Hyde. She is the CEO of the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and Mr. John Rice, who is the Vice Chair of GE. The topic of our session today is infrastructure investment, and our overriding question is, how can innovative partnerships bridge financing gaps for economic and social infrastructure? So I think over the last day and a half, we've certainly heard a lot of discussion about Africa kind of being at a crossroads. We see that we've got a lot of economic growth, it's taken root, exports are booming, foreign investment is on the rise, dependence on aid is declining. Governance reforms are transforming the political landscape. Democracy, transparency, and accountability have improved. But at the same time, we're also hearing a different narrative, as it were. And I think for many African governments, we can see that they are failing to a certain extent to really transform the growth, to transform the benefits of the commodity supercycle into benefits that affect all Africans. Now, as a consequence of this, we can see that inequality is increasing in many countries. Poverty is not falling as fast as it should, and Africa's share of global malnutrition and child deaths is increasing. So what I've also heard over the last day and a half is a very strong plea that Africa needs long-term growth that benefits all Africans. That requires nothing less than an economic transformation, and infrastructure is vital for that transformation. But Africa's infrastructure gap, as we all know, is huge. 621 million Africans do not have access to electricity. And if we exclude South Africa, sub-Saharan Africans' electricity consumption is less than that of Spain. Africa has the world's least developed network of paved roads. Companies using African ports face the world's longest delays. And water and sanitation is equally underdeveloped. And I heard this really interesting fact yesterday, actually, and it is more Africans have access to a mobile network signal than have the power to charge their device. So in short, this lack of infrastructure is a bottleneck for growth and opportunity. The same is true of finance. The reality is that Africa faces a twin deficit of infrastructure and inclusive finance. But what our panel are going to discuss here today are also the incredible opportunities across Africa. So of course, this economic growth, this population growth is creating huge demand for infrastructure. Trade opportunities are expanding, business environment is improving, and the G8 and the G20 countries have identified African infrastructure financing as a priority. And the story out of COP21 was completely different narrative in Africa. The negotiators from Africa went there, the delegates from Africa went there, and they said, we're going to change this narrative on Africa. We're not going to go with a begging bowl in our hand. We're going to say climate presents an opportunity for us to do things completely different. And I think it's that positive story that is also part of the narrative for Africa. So during this session, we'll look at issues related to the perception of risk in Africa. And I've heard that so much over the last day and a half. I mean, what do we really mean by that? What do we really mean by blended finance for public infrastructure? And finally, how can we weave in a sustainability argument into this? So with that, I'd like to turn to our first panelist, Mr. Ramaphosa. And I would really like you to share with us, sir, what kinds of infrastructure projects are you doing in South Africa to ensure that we can stimulate the growth, but at the same time reduce inequality, and linked to that, given the funding constraints and the political needs, how do you prioritize your infrastructure projects?
Thank you very much. Thank you to be here, to have this opportunity, particularly to share a little bit about what the journey that we have traversed as South Africa. And our story really starts some 21 years ago when we became a democracy. Prior to that, the infrastructure configuration in our country was more aligned to benefit a minority of minorities in our country. Whatever roads there were, whatever housing, water reticulation, electricity, was more concentrated towards favoring a minority. When the democratic government got into office, it suddenly realized that it had a huge burden of now addressing the lack of infrastructure for the majority of the people of South Africa. It got underway to do precisely that. So infrastructure development then started. And along the way, we developed a plan which we call the National Development Plan, which focuses on infrastructure, that if you want to really generate growth in your economy, you should focus on developing infrastructure, but do it on a much more focused way. And because infrastructure development was happening in bits and pieces all over the place, we felt the need to coordinate and set up what we call the Presidential Infrastructure Coordination Council. That then pulled together all infrastructure projects into one hub. And we had a secretariat that had a radar view on all infrastructure projects and the money that was being spent, the investment that was going in, and the type of infrastructure. And we decided to focus on infrastructure, both types, social infrastructure, as well as, if you like, economic infrastructure, which would be in roads and stuff like that. But social infrastructure involved houses, rolling out electricity to the majority of our people, building dams so that there can be water reticulation and all that. And the coordination effect has paid great dividends. And this is what one would like to put out as a case study, that if you coordinate and have everything that has to do with infrastructure in an office, coordinated at the top level of government, reported to the cabinet on an ongoing basis, you're almost half the way towards winning the infrastructure backlog route. But of course, finance has to be the other important aspect of this. Now, of course, our government got into debt, raised quite a bit of debt to improve infrastructure, but it has paid great dividends because it has improved the livelihood of millions of people, just taking housing. In 21 years, we've built 4.3 million houses. We've electrified almost 20 million houses in South Africa, whereas in the past, the numbers were very, very poor. And service delivery, improving the lives of people and lifting them from poverty has been a key product or dividend that we have had. It's also generated economic activity and also created some jobs, not enough jobs as to be able to stem the huge backlog that we have in relation to creating jobs. But on the financing side, we then decided to come up with innovative ways of partnering with the private sector, particularly in energy and electricity. We ran into headwinds with our energy reticulation or generation. We neglected maintaining some of our power stations for quite a while, and that caught up with us and we ran into problems. But the private sector came as independent power producers who were able to sell the energy they produce to the grid, to the national grid. Now, that opened a new window of opportunity for economic development, which has other benefits at a community level, where the private sector came and said, we have this area in your country which has a lot of wind, which has a lot of sun. We want to catch the wind, we want to catch the sun, and we developed policy to enable them to do so. And in doing so, we decided that quite a lot of the components they will use must be localized. they must be locally made, that help to develop other industries in the country, and the communities where those stations, those power stations were built, also became part of the whole developmental mix that started to happen. So we've traversed a long route. We are by no means there yet. We still have quite a lot of projects that we have to embark on, particularly with dams. We're building huge dams and a number of other projects. But infrastructure has been a key economic driver in our country, and we would greatly recommend investors to keep flowing to South Africa, because there's money to be made in South African infrastructure, and indeed, I would say African infrastructure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I just actually, please. I just want a quick follow-up question at the point that you raised right at the end, and that's what could South Africa's role be with regards to promoting better regional infrastructure projects?
Well, our president has been asked by the AU to be the coordinator of infrastructure development on the continent. And indeed, in the southern part of the country, there's quite a lot of cooperation that is happening in opening up infrastructure facilities that will lead to increased trade when it comes to energy as well. So we are doing quite a lot and intend to do much more. Infrastructure is better approached when it is done at a regional level as well, because our countries are interlinked, particularly when it comes to people movement and trade. And as it is, South Africa gets quite a lot of its water from Lesotho. So part of our infrastructure development has had to be done in another country in the sub-region. And in doing so, it has benefited Lesotho quite a lot. So has it benefited South Africans. It's about to benefit Botswana as well. And that is a mutually beneficial type of infrastructure rollout, which we support very much. So we are all up for infrastructure development that is all-encompassing because it's mutually beneficial, and it leads to economic development. And the dividend that we all earn when it comes to that in terms of employment, economic activity is quite huge, and that's what we should focus on.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Dyer, I have a question for you now. I understand that you work a lot in real estate. I wondered if you could just share with us how real estate links to infrastructure, power, urban development. Just share with us some of your thoughts on that. And then if you could just help explain to us, and this is a discussion that many people have had, why risk is perceived as very high for Africa. Is there something about the narrative that people are sharing internationally that's not truly reflective of what's going on in Africa?
Right. Well, to those of you who don't know our company, we advise on real estate services, all aspects of real estate from investment by sovereign wealth funds right through to your individual company's need for space in Lagos. And we do that globally in 70 countries. So we have a very good view of the continuum between the very highly developed West European, US countries, right through to the more challenged areas of Asia and Africa. And so we can see some trends and similarities across various different economies at the various stages of their development. Real estate, infrastructure, and the urban environment are all inextricably linked together. You can build physical infrastructure, but unless you have buildings and a quality urban environment to attract people and companies and begin this process of creativity and wealth creation that happens when you urbanize, as much of Africa is just in the process of beginning, really. That's what creates long-term wealth. That's what creates, to Mr. Ramaphosa's point, profits for companies, for indigenous as well as international companies. So to us, as real estate professionals, experts and advisors globally, the quality of the urban environment and the quality of its infrastructure are all inextricably linked. So from the area of our expertise, which is real estate development and financing, and how does that happen in developing countries. Just a single number for you. Last year, sort of investment quality real estate traded globally was about $700 billion. Half of that is cross-border investment. Less than 10 billion came into the entire African continent, and most of that went into two countries, which are Nigeria and South Africa. So there is indeed a disproportionately small amount of international capital flowing into Africa. From McKinsey's number this morning, across the broad sector of commercial investment, across all sectors, less than 4% is flowing into Africa. So there's clearly a big deficit in investment. Why is it that foreign direct investment, international investment is so important to Africa? It's obvious really, but we've seen it in China, Indonesia, India, as they've gone through their cycles of development. When domestic capital markets are shallow, not reliable, and certainly not available to provide capital in the medium and long term, you simply are obliged as countries to attract international capital. How do you do that? Whether it's equity or debt, how do you do that in the period before domestic capital markets become mature and deep enough to be able to fund domestically? You have to create an environment which international capital finds acceptable. And this is where we come to the point of perceived risk. Again, to misquote somebody from this morning, the press globally loves to scream problems and whisper success. And nowhere is that more true than in Africa. And the press internationally screams the problems in Africa, be they security, corruption, you name it. But the successes, which are behind the 4.5% annual growth across Africa, are not really out there. Now, companies operating here do know that. They do know the success stories, but they're kind of still drowned out by the noise of the problems that are noisily reported. But international capital, international companies need 4 critical things, which we group together and call transparency. In the real estate world, investors need transparency of information about costs and returns and the initial and the ultimate purchase and sale price of real estate and the lease price of that real estate to do commercial underwriting for their transactions. So they need data and transparency of information. They need reliable judicial systems. You'll only attract money if it can be sure it'll be fairly dealt with, and if it can be sure that it will be able to retain ownership of the asset that it's purchased through the life cycle and beyond to sale. International capital is looking for low levels of bureaucracy and reducing levels of bureaucracy in order to be able to deal in an efficient and simple way. And a good example of that, by the way, is here in Rwanda, the only country we know where you can actually establish a company online. Maybe Mr. Ramaphosa will contradict that. So low levels of bureaucracy, and finally, obviously, low levels of corruption. And if you take those 4 things together, transparency of data, judicial systems, low levels of bureaucracy, and low levels of corruption, that's the challenge for many African nations. And I thought the point you made, sir, about if you can deal with things in a coordinated way, almost in one room, but at least in one program around those elements of transparency, that's the way you move the attractiveness of a country forward. So I hope that helps with some sense of why real estate and the urban environment and infrastructure are linked, and some of the opportunities and challenges for international capital in Africa.
No, thank you. I think that was very, very helpful. Thank you. I'd like to move to Ms. Hyde now. I understand you got back from Malawi, yes, and you were working on helping the government reform the power utility to make it creditworthy partner for independent power producers. And I think the utilities are actually worldwide, it's hugely challenging to get a fully functional, effective utility. But just relating it back to what Mr. Dyer was saying about issues of transparency and all these other issues, which are vital for utilities. I wondered if you could share with us some of your experiences on reforming the utilities.
Thank you. So, as many of you know, the Millennium Challenge Corporation is a different type of U.S. development agency. It was founded relatively new, the new kid on the block, just 12 years ago, and founded on many of the principles that the panelists here are espousing. It's different in a couple of key ways. First of all, it is competitive grants for countries that are meeting indicators, transparent, objective indicators around economic freedoms and governance and the degree to which they invest their resources in their people. And it is truly based on a very partner country-led design and implementation of our program. And the grants themselves are 5-year instruments. They average roughly $350 million, although they have ranged from 70 to 700 million. And it is a very strict 5-year clock for implementation, so the money will evaporate at that point. Over the course of the decade, MCC has signed 19 compacts with 15 African countries. We've invested roughly 65% of the portfolio here in Africa, so $6.5 billion. And importantly, 70% of that has been invested in infrastructure, so roads, bridges, and increasingly energy infrastructure. MCC is just initiating its second generation of compacts. 4 of the last 5 that we have brought to the board have been solely focused in energy, and they have represented more than $1 billion in grant assistance. So increasingly, MCC is looking at the energy sector and looking at what is often the public good in the energy sector, which is the utility, and focusing our resources and our expertise on turning around the utility to make it a credit-worthy off-taker of private IPPs, PPAs, and obviously the large amount of private capital that's going into generation. There are a number of countries where this is the case. I would say Malawi was one of our first partnerships where we're focused there. The compact in Malawi is $350 million. As many of you know, less than 10% of the country is connected to the grid in Malawi. And the utility, ESCOM, the other ESCOM, is our key partner. We're doing a number of things. We have done and supported a forensic audit. We've updated all of the IT systems. Most importantly, we've done an assessment of the tariff structure. There have been incremental rises in the tariff. I think we have a bit to go there. There are a number of technical advisors that we're supporting in the utility. And during my visit there, we learned that Malawi is just about to sign its first ever PPA, and that the plan for the next year would be to move the utility into the black. So we see this as critical in addition to the actual substations and the like that we are building there. The investment in the utility to turn it around, because of MCC's approach, which is also unique. The Deputy President spoke of coordination. That commitment to country-led implementation means that there is a coordination unit that is housed in the the President's office, or related to the Finance Ministry. And that coordination unit is what is driving this program. So the political will is at that level of the investment.
Thank you. Mr. Rice, I just want to give you a quote from President Adesina of the African Development Bank. And he says, "Africa is simply tired of being kept in the dark." So huge opportunity, 621 million Africans without access to electricity. And I think over the last year and a half, we can see immense political momentum to do something about this challenge, but this opportunity. And there's lots of new partnerships that are emerging. Power Africa is one of them, and many others. I wonder if you could share with us some of the things that you see are very positive, but yet some of the challenges too related to this momentum and these partnerships.
Well, first of all, I think Africa should be tired of being kept in the dark. But it's not just Africa. There's 1.5 billion people in the world that lack adequate access to electricity, and more than a third live in Africa. So this is a concentrated part of the problem, but it's not the only problem. And we live in a world where increasingly people are fed up with that, because they know that if you want to achieve this aspiration we call sustainable inclusive growth, where people have a chance to have a better life than their parents and their kids have a better life than they do, it's impossible to have without electricity. You need a few other things too, but if you don't have electricity, it's all empty talk. And there have been some very good initiatives contemplated, Power Africa being one of them, but if you look today at the number of megawatts that are actually on the grid directly related to the Power Africa initiative, it's very little. And there's a lot of factors that go into that, but I think the first thing we have to do is understand why, because that was a well-intentioned effort with a lot of smart people, a lot of willing participants, financial institutions, and yet for some reason it couldn't come together. I think there's a number of factors, two of which I'll talk about today. One is finance. You know, everybody says that they'll put capital into these projects, and then we define risk in our traditional old school ways. And so getting if you don't get capital to these power projects, they're not going to happen. So we have to think differently about how we assess risk. I think governments and bureaucracies have to act differently. Very few are paid to go fast because they think if they go fast, they're going to be accused of being corrupt. I think the point that the Deputy President made about having a coordinating structure for infrastructure makes a lot of sense, because the decisions get sucked up into short-term political expediency and grind to a halt. We're working on an emergency power project in Ghana that has taken us 16 months to get to the purchase price agreement approval by Parliament. That's an emergency power project. So I don't know how long it would take if it wasn't an emergency. And so we have to condition governments and bureaucracies to be ready to move, to push these projects forward, or they're going to languish. And that contributes to the absence of power connected with Power Africa. And then the last point I'd make, and this directly related to the Deputy President's point, is the ability to balance short-term and long-term. You know, we live in a world where increasingly the cycle is around the next election. And when you're talking about infrastructure investments and power projects, you got to have the ability to get way past the next election. And if you don't, those projects probably aren't going to happen.
I'm going to ask Ms. Hyde to comment on the Power Africa, but before I do that, I just have a quick follow-up question for you. And it's related to the incredible momentum from COP21. And, you know, across Africa, we can see there's so many energy entrepreneurs is a term that I've heard. And I'm just wondering how GE is thinking about ways in bringing in the energy entrepreneurs, bringing in the innovators, bringing in the emerging African scientists into this space, into this energy space. Are you working with any at that level to really capitalize on this incredible momentum and opportunity?
We work with all of them, and we have a broad array of technologies in renewables and all sorts of power generating technologies that use fossil fuels more efficiently. But I also think it's important not to forget, notwithstanding COP21, that there's a lot of countries in the world that don't work without coal. So you can't kind of forget about coal. We all have a responsibility to figure out how to use it in a more environmentally responsible way. So clean coal technologies, we do care about the environment, we do care about global warming, but we can't pretend that COP21 gives us the opportunity to forget about coal, because probably 40% of the world's population live in countries where without coal those economies don't work.
Yeah, and I'd like to underline that point, because Africa's global carbon footprint is 2.3% without South Africa, so it's tiny. So African countries should be able to have the energy mix which is appropriate for their own development. So I would very much support that. So Ms. Hyde, please, if you could share with us the Power Africa.
So I think John's making very good points about the time horizon, and I think that's really the prism through which we should evaluate and look at the Power Africa initiative. There is a robust pipeline. I think results are not coming in terms of closing deals as quickly yet, but I see a great reason for optimism over the next year. I mean, I think I've never seen such alignment, not just among the U.S. Donors and private sector, but in the international community around this set of objectives. And I think that, we've seen certainly in the health sector, when there is that concentration of attention around a need and that consensus, which I think Power Africa has really helped build. We were speaking earlier about the predicate for development in so many ways is energy. And I think there's really a recognition of that. And that Power Africa, by bringing the private sector and the donor community and the multilaterals, all of the various capital streams together, we will get there. The other good news, I would say, is that recently, in terms of longevity, the United States Congress passed the Electrify Africa bill, which is an effort to codify and not make this a flash in the pan effort, but to say we're behind bringing power and energy across the continent for all of the reasons that we've talked about throughout the week, and I think we'll go forward strongly. I know MCC in particular, I mean, I mentioned 4 of our last 5 investments, over $1 billion, is focused in energy right now. And our leverage ability there, we too are working with GE and others in Ghana, and again, focusing on how we can leverage private capital toward these objectives.
Thank you. I'd like to throw it open to the floor now, just to pick up some questions for our panel members, based on anything that you have heard or any burning questions. Is this an opportunity? Anybody feeling positive, negative?
Before you do so,
Yes.
just a very kind and friendly correction to Mr. Rice, that politicians hardly ever do any infrastructure development program for elections. We always do them for the people.
I stand corrected, thank you.
Questions from the floor. Please, sir. Yes. Please. Do you have some? The mic's just coming.
Thank you very much. This is very interesting panel. My point is on financial caps. I am in the Central Committee of the WCC, and we are speaking a lot about social justice. How can we introduce or to improve the international financial legislation to give the same opportunities to the countries suffering of poverty, like in Latin America, Asia, Africa? For example, now South Africa, they have to pay about $10 billion to serve their debt. There are not equal treatment to the countries suffering of poverty. They have to pay double interest. I was 2 weeks ago in Zambia, in Lusaka, and some members of my church, I am a bishop in Zimbabwe and Angola, and they started building a supermarket. And suddenly, the interest came up to 48%, so they stopped everything. So my question is very simple. First of all, how to give equal opportunities, the investors to be controlled by the states, by the international community, when they come to invest money in countries suffering of poverty. And then, if, for example, South Africa is going to pay $10 billion, why not to introduce also legislation, 50% of this money to come back and to protect our children, at least the children not to be victims of our sins, of our mistakes, to offer to them equal opportunities. But I feel very privileged as the Deputy President, Mr. Ramaphosa, is here, and to play this role of the political stability with the President Zuma, not in South Africa, but in the whole continent.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions from the floor? Questions? I think we can, Mr. Ramaphosa, I'm going to ask you to answer that question.
Well, I think the question is best answered by people who operate in the financial sector, who are either bankers or development finance institutions people. What I think the bishop is saying, really, he's echoing what you will find amongst many ordinary people, that why should countries that are poor be paying so much for the debt that they they take in terms of interest rates. And he cites a very good example where a project which was about to take off had to be stopped because the interest rates nearly doubled. That comes across as being very punitive. Because when you look at the financial architecture of the world, it tends to favor the rich individuals as well as countries that are far wealthier. When they take debt, they often find that their interest rate is often reduced a bit, and it's loaded to other countries because of factors such as risk and stability and what have you. And I think we should pay heed to what the bishop is saying and see the extent to which the financial architecture can be made a lot fairer for poorer countries, and introduces a very interesting concept that if you pay back your debt, shouldn't part of the money be reinvested in the country where initially the debt was raised. So I think that those are interesting concepts. It has to do with how the financial infrastructure of the world or architecture of the world functions. And paying heed to ordinary people also means listening to what the Archbishop is also saying. Thank you.
Thank you.
If I could perhaps just
please go ahead.
bring that question from a social, political to the business and the capital markets perspective. Currently, capital is in desperate need internationally of return. And to sort of quote some examples, a speculative construction of an infrastructure project in Burma might be looking for a 25% return, but lending to the government of Germany, you get 0.1% return, if that. So the markets price risk according to their perceived, the price debt according to their perception of risk. In the case of sovereign debt, our experience is that it's not priced that differently to the way by lending institutions to the way they evaluate corporates. So they're looking at this in governance terms, in corporate terms, they're looking at the governance, the quality and the record, the track record of the leaders of a company. They're looking at their transparency, the availability of information, and their track record. And so when you look, if you're lending to a sovereign or lending to a project which is heavily developed, heavily dependent on the government environment, the political environment of a country, those are the sorts of things that they're looking at. They're looking then at the political stability of a country, the continuity of political leadership. They're looking at the quality of governance, quality of government in a country, and they're looking at the security of the environment to which they're lending. And all of those things have very strict parallels to the corporate sector. Now, it may seem quite harsh to take a social question and put it in those terms, but those are the realities of the way lending institutions look. So what does a country have to do in that environment? It has to understand that that's the way that their debt, the borrowing that they do, is priced, and therefore a continuous record of good governance, of stability, of security in that country and in that environment are the sorts of things over a long term which produce lower levels of pricing for debt. So it's not as simple, it's a multifaceted thing, but it all comes back, I think, to the quality and consistency of governance in a country, same as in a company.
So, I think it raises a very interesting question, because if you take a look at a country like Nigeria, which tries to operate with 190 million people and 3 or 4 gigawatts of operating power, does sovereign risk in Nigeria go up or down if that problem doesn't get fixed, right? Yeah. And it probably goes up. And so the question, I think, is whether you could modify international lending standards to allow for more latitude when the investment is going to the right infrastructure projects. So the IMF, the World Bank, the global institutions that set the running rules, exercise a little more flexibility in the right countries with the right projects.
That's interesting.
That's right, and I think I used to work for the World Bank actually, and I think in the past, if the country was perceived as high risk or a fragile country, then the lending will be reduced, but it should actually be the other way around, and I think they are moving in that direction, certainly. But I'd like to ask the panel another question, which is linked to your question, sir, and it is about the international financing systems, and we're hearing a lot lately about tax and how the global tax system is basically broken. And you'll see these big discussions now, and what is happening to tax? And when you start to look underneath that at the global level, we really don't know who owns a lot of these companies, and that's important because a lot of the money is going out of African countries, which really should be invested in infrastructure. So it's all linked. So we have a challenge with the global tax system, which I'd really like to hear the panel's thoughts on, especially around the transparency of companies. Who owns the companies, and should we have registries? Should they be public? And my second question for the panel, which I think is very important, is domestic resource mobilization. And some African countries have made great strides into reforming their tax systems. But this is a big imperative because we need the domestic resources, and then we need to blend them with other financing. So, Mr. Ramaphosa, I wondered if you could just share with us some of your thoughts on those two issues.
Yeah, on the issue of tax, I think we have a lot to be grateful for the initiative that was started by the African Union, where they appointed former President Thabo Mbeki to have a microscopic look at issues of money seepage out of the African continent, tax issues. And he's come up with a very good report which has shown that Africa has in effect been losing billions and billions of rands through tax evasion, through a number of mechanisms which companies have been using, but has also been losing quite a lot of money where African leaders, wealthy people have actually been siphoning money out of their own countries, essentially out of the African continent. So this is something where we need to close some holes, some loops, so that it doesn't continue to happen. And in order for it not to happen is to actually come up with tighter regulation, particularly on the stoppage of tax havens. The Panama Papers have revealed a huge web of iniquity that has been happening around the world, and that's something that demonstrates that this whole problem calls out for attention and resolution. And our own tax authorities, our Treasury, our Finance Department, is looking very closely at this and will be tightening up a lot of rules in this regard. But also, one of the things that we have benefited from as a country is to increase tax collection. Our income tax collector has been very good, has been really robust, and has been one of those institutions that we are hugely proud of, because its effectiveness has led South Africans to feel proud that they're now becoming taxpayers in a very credible way and paying tax to a legitimate and stable and democratic government. And that has enhanced the whole process of paying tax. And therefore, this needs to be something that is spread around the continent. Many countries on our continent are not succeeding in collecting as much tax as they should. And so there are quite a lot of lessons that we can learn from each other, not only in terms of tax collection, but also in terms of stopping the seepage of valuable money out of the continent to a number of tax havens. Because it's important, if we want our continent to develop, that all the money should be here in this continent. And even the national reserves should also be in Africa rather than outside Africa, so that they can work for the countries on the continent. In some cases, even national reserves are in some banks offshore, and that too needs to come to a stop, so that we have all the money to develop our continent. Thank you very much.
Sure. So I think it's a very good question. I connected to a number of themes that you mentioned in your opening. Clearly, the sustainability of investments in infrastructure. So I think, as many of you know, domestic resource mobilization was a central theme of the Addis Conference of Financing for Development last summer as we went into the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals. And it is an area that both MCC and I believe other public sector donors are increasingly focused on. We have one project in our portfolio currently in the Philippines, which has taken of a $500 million compact, $30 million solely focused on domestic resource mobilization, bringing technology, capacity. Data is often a real challenge in this space as well. And what we're seeing is that collection has gone up tenfold in the last 4 years. And we're really diving into what are the attributes of that. But I do believe it is an area for public donors and public sector investment similar to the institution such as utilities, where you can really leverage quite a bit of impact, development impact from your investment. So I think it's critical. I think we will look to see how in our partnerships we can do more of those types of interventions going forward. And just a couple of words about transparency. Transparency is very much at the core of the MCC model, and we are working across with all of our partners on transparency in procurement, in fiscal accountability, as a way of shoring up the governance and the other challenges that our partners face. Again, our experience is that there's a real willingness, often a willingness, it is a capacity challenge around systems and data, and a very operational logistic challenge within these institutions to be able to deliver on.
I mean, to the tax issue or the tax collection issue, I mean, this isn't just an African problem, it's a global problem. And the Panama Papers illustrated that very clearly, from very much less developed countries right through to the very well-developed countries. I think a number of things are working to help the situation. I talked earlier on about transparency. We've been tracking transparency across multiple countries for several decades, and the clear trend is for economies to become more transparent. And so that same thing is happening in this area of corruption and taxes, to the extent they're linked. And I think a number of things just to pull out of that. First of all, the internet is making a lot more data available a lot quicker and in a lot more depth. Snowden showed that, but it applies to the economic sphere as well. So that in itself is aiding transparency and information availability, which is a counter to the sort of thing that creates funds which get sent informally outside countries. Secondly, the informal economy in most countries is reducing. It can be very large in some countries. I mean, in Italy, it's probably around 20% of the total economy, but it is coming down. And that informal economy, remember, is not paying taxes. So there's theft, if you like, from the tax base of individual countries. And that's also being helped by this transparency and availability of information issue. The third thing is that banks globally and the transmission systems globally are being really attacked by governments. And it's becoming unacceptable for banks to deal with people, customers they do not know. So the KYC regulation, which we see through our big investment world of real estate, is really quite rigorous now, and it's being enforced. And to the extent that the long reach of the US has helped this get underway, well, it's a bit too perhaps imperialistic in its style, but it's certainly created a catalytic effect for this process worldwide. And the final thing is that the acceptability of tax planning and dodging globally by corporates or individuals is also becoming less and less acceptable. Thank you, Amazon, for sort of blowing that thing up into the public view in the more developed countries first. But those four things together are, I think, helping to mitigate the situation and make the informal availability of money, which then is transferred outside of developing economies, harder and harder to do.
Thank you, thank you. We just have 5 minutes left, but I want to ask Mr. Rice a question before I ask each of the panel members just to share with us one or two key reflections of the discussion that we've had just now. But John, my question for you is, could you share with us some of the amazing success stories that we've had in Africa related to any infrastructure sector? Because there's so many good things happening across Africa. There's so many success stories. We see so many regional projects which are working. We can see energy entrepreneurs emerging. So the situation is one of excitement and energy and on many different platforms. So I wondered if you could just share with us some of the success stories that you're seeing from your point of view, and then I'll hand over everybody to do their reflections.
I'd say just in the last year or two, successful wind projects where we were involved in the development stage, but in South Africa, in Kenya, in a number of other countries. The other thing I think that's happening in Africa that's really relevant to this discussion is the private enterprise. I mean, you have leading companies that are in this room that are taking initiative to put in infrastructure, power generation, and other infrastructure projects to benefit their countries. So I think there's a lot of that going on that's going to be an impactful part of this process. And the last thing I'd comment on, we've talked a lot about power. You referred to healthcare. There are really some tremendous things happening in many countries in Africa around healthcare and the provision of basic healthcare services for people who don't necessarily live in the capital cities, who live in faraway places. They're having access to services that they haven't had before. We're part of that. There are many other companies that are part of it, but I think a lot of progress and a lot of success in that aspect of infrastructure development.
Great, thank you. So, Mr. Rice, I'm going to start with you on your reflections, and then I'll come this way down the panel. Just if you could just share with us maybe a couple of takeaways from the discussion here.
I'd say speed matters. So we live in a world where you have access to a lot of information. People in the most desolate parts of a country anywhere in the world have access to information that they didn't have 10 years ago. The level of accountability and transparency that governments and companies have to operate in is as high as it's ever been and going to get higher. You know, we don't have forever to solve these problems, and we see examples all the time around the world of what happens when you don't. So speed matters. We've got to figure this out. We've got to look at why things don't work and fix the problems, because we have to move this ball forward.
Thank you. Dana?
I would say we heard a number of times the themes of governance, the importance of governance and will and institutions, and the term I like not to use, which is capacity, but it does convey the sentiment. You know, I think as we think about the resources to meet the infrastructure gaps, the challenge, particularly to the public sector donors, is to try to focus on those areas where they are uniquely suited to address. And oftentimes the private sector is not uniquely suited to address the institutions and the governance and the underpinnings for private investment. So I think there is a need for public donors to be very strategic about their scarce dollars, recognizing that private capital is a growing and the largest share of capital for development these days, and that's something that we really need to take on board as we go forward in the next 5 to 10 years.
I'll go for 3 if I can. Firstly, I think across our corporate base globally, the interest in Africa is high and growing, and I'd say it's about the level that it was in Asia 30 years ago. And if you look at how developing Asia has moved on, that's good news. It means there's interest, and that means there's money and intellectual property wanting to get into Africa. I'd say secondly, there are now some increasingly clear examples of what good governance looks like at the governmental level across Africa, and to the extent populations are now talking more, they will demand that more clearly. The third thing is very personal. I came to this conference in Cape Town last year and again here. I go to these conferences internationally. This is unique in the sense that I hear more business opportunities being discussed back and forward across the table spontaneously in meetings with partners and potential partners here than any other conference I go to, which says there's a lot of life, a lot of energy in the continent amongst the people who come at least to this conference.
Thank you very much. Many South Africans will say today that the country that they live in is very different from the country they lived in 21 years ago. And it's largely because of the infrastructure development that has unfolded in our country. And in the course of all this, we have learned a great deal. The first point I mentioned was coordination, and fortunately, the minister who coordinates our infrastructure rollout is Minister Patel, and he's sitting here. And the coordination has really helped him to have very good sight of all the infrastructure programs that are unfolding in the country and where the problems are, the gaps are, and the challenges. And what it has also done, which we are actually trying to roll out more, is to enhance government's own project management capability, where you get really smart people, clever people who are engineers, who are accountants, who come and assist government to make those projects happen, and to happen on time, on budget, and to the benefit of all. The other important aspect of coordination is that you need, as you coordinate, to increase transparency. Transparency so that people can be aware of the full ramifications of every project, be it the tendering process where corruption often happens. And if you increase transparency, you then reduce temptation for corruption, incidents of corruption. It's important also at a social level to increase transparency, because it then enhances accountability. Then the public officials become more accountable to the people, and because the people can then hold us to what we have said we would do, how we would do it, at what price we would do it. Another important aspect, and I shut up, is the extent to which these projects have helped us to, we often use the term, crowd in the private sector. It's a horrible term. I prefer to invite the private sector to work with the private sector in meaningful, mutually beneficial partnerships. We've proven it with allowing the private sector to develop power stations or power producing facilities on an independent basis, without much interference from government, following all the rules. We're now about to go into a coal-fired power station, which we will allow the private sector to develop. And these are mega projects. But we've now embraced the idea of working with the private sector at close range, where we are mutually benefiting one another. And the other important aspect is that the communities where all these projects happen must be part of the development. They must not find that the projects, if it's a hospital that's being built, it must not be foisted on them. They must be part of the whole development process from the beginning, from planning, from every brick that is laid. The community must have a sense of ownership. If it's a school, they must be involved. In the end, they must say, this is our school. It was facilitated by government. The private sector participated in the building of this bridge or this dam, but we were, as a community, a part of it. It addresses the issue that was raised by President Kagame this morning, that in the end, all what we are doing should be focused on people, because it is being done for them. So it should never be done above them, but with them as part of the whole scheme and as part of the process. And if we can do that, then our infrastructure programs or projects can gain more meaning, and we can have a wonderfully working partnership between community, government, the private sector, and developmental funding institutions. Thank you very much.
Very much. Thank you very much. So this just leaves me with a little bit of time to do a very quick summary. First of all, I think what we heard today was the importance of a coordinating structure, and all the panel members have mentioned that. But coordination with transparency is critical. There's a lot of discussion about the short term and the long term, and the politics that underpin those big questions about the short term and long term. But there's also a real imperative for urgency. And even when we have urgency, things aren't moving fast enough. So I think that's something that we all in this room need to really focus on. We also heard that success is drowned out. So we are mini ambassadors, so we should really try and change this narrative on Africa. John clearly said, and I quote, we define risk in our traditional old school ways, so we need to define risk differently. So John has challenged us to define risk differently. And Mr. Ramaphosa made a very important point that the international financial architecture is faulty, and we need to close some of the loops. And I think we had a good discussion on that, and I think there is a willingness politically on a global level to do that, but it needs pushing. And Dana said very clearly that the importance of domestic resource mobilization, that's important for sustainability too. So I think that's something that also needs to be focused upon. But what I also hear is that interest in Africa is high, and it's growing, and I think we have definitely heard that over the last day and a half. And we've also heard about this business opportunities across Africa in many, many countries, and governments working hand in hand with private sector, with civil society, because ultimately infrastructure is not about the bricks and mortar. As Mr. Ramaphosa clearly said, it's about the people. So I'd like to end there. I'd like you to help me thank the panel today for a very interesting discussion, and thank you all for coming. Thank you.